Good morning, everyone. Today is April 20th, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everybody who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And one of our favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce the running total of just how much our audiences have contributed to food banks worldwide in honor of our great speakers. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
With pleasure. Well, hello, everyone. Remember, it wasn't too long ago we were talking, let's hit 350, let's hit 375. Well, we've hit $385,005.40 in donations, of which we've been told, and we know it has to be much more than that. So 400,000, here we come. Our 3-year anniversary is in 2 weeks. Let's see if we can hit the 400,000 in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.
Fabulous. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Jean, and thank you all. Today, we're going to have another terrific presentation from Ken Webb, principal at Ken Webb Consulting LLC. He's going to talk about the power of questions, taking it to the next level. Imagine the possibilities when asking questions with greater intent and purpose beyond just finding out facts we want to know. What about questions that could potentially shift perspective while maintaining neutrality? Establish shared clarity, understand and manage risk, as well as helping others articulate their interests. In this presentation, Ken will examine the persuasive power of questions and how they can bring increased value to all involved. For the past 30 plus years, Ken's greatest passion and most extensive experience has been the facilitation of learning experiences that make a difference in people's lives with a strong emphasis on relevant, real-world application. Ken, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then my question is, can you please tell us more about the power of questions? My friend, the floor is yours.
I appreciate it, Jeff. Thank you very much, and congratulations on what appears to be quite a knockout number so far this year. That's great. I hope it continues. The food bank that I'm myself and my wife are rather committed to has been St. Mary's Food Bank out here in the greater Phoenix, Arizona area, and they're one of the largest food banks and one of the more successful food banks. They've been doing quite a job. They have quite a history out in this part of the country. So I wanted to do whatever I could to support them. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do that. A little bit, if you don't mind, just a very little bit about myself, and as I kind of get into this, only because it provides somewhat of a context for the topic in terms of why I'm fascinated by the topic and where I plan to go. And I'm going to share my screen with you. The background experience, as Jeff mentioned, I've been since 1986 doing both training and consulting in the area of performance improvement with Fortune 1000 companies, and have been rather fascinated at how some people seem to be so effective at communication skills in terms of how they persuade others. That's been and that experience got started back in 1986 when I first joined what was called Citibank at the time as a training director. and got involved in a change initiative where we trained people on the art of asking questions in the interest of trying to further improve our client relationships and, of course, bring in business. And we trained people in the art of asking questions. I helped managers learn how to coach and mentor them and prepare for those client conversations. And what was absolutely amazing when we collected some data both before we undertook the training and about 9 months later, we were rather amazed at a 17% increase in the success of client meetings that were directly related to people's ability to ask the kind of questions that not just got at information, but actually helped to more quickly utilize more effectively the face time people had with their clients and end up with outcomes that were quite productive for not only the clients, but for us. The fact that the business actually realized a 12% bump in revenue also accompanied the successful calls. But that was just a really huge eye opener in terms of the power of persuasion. Now, what I find fascinating now that I've had some exposure to mediation over the last 4 years or so is just recognizing, obviously, the interesting balance between neutrality and persuasion, and it raised the question in my mind: does persuasion really have a place in mediation, and can it be done while we maintain neutrality? Something that we might want to talk a bit about as we go through this. But the overview of what we plan to do here and talk about is, I thought it might be helpful if we started out taking a look at 3 classes of behavior that kind of forms the basis, if you will, of effective interactions anytime people get together in a meeting and work toward problem solving to an outcome that's useful to them. So I'm going to be looking at not only some research that occurred a while back, but also introducing some of the results that we experienced during the course of our research. And I'm speaking of some research that I was involved in with my colleague, Eva Abramowitz, who I think might be with us today. But we'll look at 3 classes of behavior just to kind of organize things around which we can have some discussion, looking at a couple of different styles of persuasion, and have a little bit of chat about when different styles of persuasion might be more appropriate or effective. Also take a look at we're going to spend some time at looking at negotiator behavior data, because there has been some rather excellent research that specifically looked into the behavior of effective negotiators that differentiated them from average negotiators that we're still using today, still effective and relevant today. And we've built on that research that I'll be sharing with you. That brings us to some discussion about how to go about building trust. Obviously, the relationship or trust that's actually developed in mediation is absolutely critical. Trying to mitigate and help minimize what parties often view as risk in a mediation, building trust seems to help considerably, obviously, with disclosure level and the quality of the inputs we receive from parties during the course of mediations toward reaching settlement. And then last but not least, we'll look at different question types and different uses of those questions and have some discussion about them. Now, the behaviors I'd say about 4 years ago, I received a call from Ava Abramowitz asking if I'd consider joining her in her efforts to get a little bit clearer about what's actually going on in mediations and see what really distinguished top mediators in terms of their ability not only to do a really effective mediation, but more importantly, to achieve successful outcomes and implementations that seem to be sustainable over time. And the latter point on sustainability, absolutely critical, and we'll be talking more about it. But when looking at different kinds of behavior, I want to distinguish behavior from, say, discussion strategy. In that we're looking at, when we're talking about behavior, we're talking about very individual and discrete behavior versus discussion strategy that might be rather complex, that often involves multiple behaviors. But when we talk about behaviors themselves, I think we're talking about the atoms, if you will, the atoms and molecules of effective conversation. So we're going to be very, very specific. So on this research effort that Ava and I got involved in, we felt it rather important to really embrace specific behavior categories. And I wanted to define them up front so that as you took a look at them, they would be in some context for you. First of all of the behaviors that we were taking a look at and that we were on the hunt for can be actually measured accurately, can be easily understood. They're distinct from other categories, and people can change how often they use them. And last but not least, they need to be related to effectiveness of performance. So that helped us then really get down to the essence of what each behavior was about and carefully define them in such a way that we could accurately recognize them and as they are used in mediations. So back in the 60s, there was a research effort that was conducted by Neil Rackham that took a look at different classes of behavior that were important to any group that tends to undertake some sort of problem solving or complete a task. And it was one of the first efforts. It was the first effort where researchers were actually allowed into negotiations to witness what was going on rather than conducting interviews to try to find out. He realized or found that there were 3 classes of behavior, one of which was initiating behaviors that tend to put forth ideas, concepts, suggestions, courses of actions, and that sort of thing. But there were also behaviors around reacting. They tend to constitute an evaluation of other people's contributions in these meetings. And third, but certainly not least, was clarifying behaviors that exchange information, facts, opinions, etc. So why these 3 classes of behavior? What's their relative importance or significance? Well, any group, like I mentioned earlier, that really is looking to solve a problem or complete a task, the combination of these 3 helps ensure that the meeting goes in a way that not only everyone participates and contributes to the outcome, but everyone tends to be more satisfied and engaged in terms of the outcome and committed to those outcomes. When we take a look at some of the specific behavior that was associated with effective communication in these 3 areas, here's a number of 9 of them here. proposing and building in terms of initiating, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and reacting, supporting, disagreeing, and even defend attack styles when the discussion gets a bit heated between parties sometimes. Clarifying behaviors, obviously testing, understanding, summarizing, seeking information, giving information. Those behaviors help clarify the inputs that are on the table so that everybody gets on the same page. Now, let me just take just a quick station break, and this will require, I'd be interested in your thoughts, and we can do this. We can do this just by the chat box if you like, and that is, if in fact people were coming together for a brainstorming meeting. In other words, the purpose of that meeting was to get together, get lots of ideas, et cetera, and that's the primary purpose. Which of these three classes of behavior would you expect higher levels of? Initiating, reacting, or clarifying? What's your sense? If you wouldn't mind jotting that down in the chat box, just one of those three. Which of those three would you suspect would you expect higher levels of in a brainstorming meeting? And if Jeff, if you wouldn't mind, you or Jane, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us what people indicate in the chat box, their choices, that would be great.
Well, Gene and I seem to agree that initiating is high on the list.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the case. Now, one might ask, well, how can you actually utilize this and get some value out of it? Well, obviously, we've all been involved in meetings that haven't quite gone the way that we expected or that we had hoped. And oftentimes when doing some diagnosis, we find that if in fact certain behaviors are not driven and encouraged, then they may fall short of expectation. If we take this another step, we could ask about if we were getting together for the purpose of specifically for problem solving, which class of behaviors would you then expect higher levels of? Initiating, reacting, or clarifying? Sounds like a trick question, doesn't it?
We have 3 votes for clarifying.
Ah. Now.
It's a landslide, Ken.
Sorry?
It's a landslide for clarifying.
Okay. Well, hold on to your chairs. Actually, it's all 3. And maybe it was a bit of a trick question. But consider this, if you will. A good problem-solving meeting also needs a really good dose of initiating. In other words, we have to be putting ideas out on the table, proposing different things that can help solve a problem. But also, if people within the group were not reacting to those proposals, sharing what they thought about them, helping to evaluate inputs that are offered, then it's harder to make progress and feel like we're reaching something that, in terms of group consensus, that's really going to be useful and helpful. Clarifying is one of the most important classes of behavior here, but all 3 of these are actually necessary and absolutely key to problem-solving meetings. Now, this may beg the question, well, how much of each is necessary? And actually that varies depending upon the type of meeting. But I wanted to generate some thought here, first of all, in terms of What's the dynamic that's often going on, for example, even in mediations? In an effective mediation, which class of behaviors, again, would you expect higher levels of? And I'm going to jump to the punchline here. Again, all three. Absolutely critical. And it was interesting as we've done a little bit of our research thus far, not only did this prove to be true, but it was also interesting taking a look at the different levels of these three classes of behavior. More on that in a bit. Let me do a quick summary before we go any further in terms of some points we've made thus far. Persuasion and neutrality can coexist. Obviously, persuasion on one end of the spectrum could further the speaker's intent in ways that are pushing their own interests. But what I'm talking about here as it relates to neutrality is there are ways in which we can be persuasive in the interest of helping others. It's kind of like asking questions to help someone really think through the pros and cons of something that they're looking to do, wanting to do, or maybe even avoid in the interest of helping them make a decision that's right for them. That's where persuasion can coexist with neutrality, obviously. All three classes of behavior that we've talked about thus far has got to be represented in interactions at levels appropriate to the desired outcomes. So it varies by different meetings. What gets to be rather important, I would think, in mediations in particular would be that mediators can actually compensate to ensure the right balance of behaviors occur to achieve sustainable outcomes. We've all seen situations where the use, for example, of testing understanding and summarizing by one or two people in a meeting can actually start influencing that behavior with others because it's helpful. But we can actually drive and increase certain kinds of behaviors if we're more aware and prepared to do so in terms of when we think about how we go about preparation before mediations. So let's take a look at this dynamic we're calling persuasion and look at what some of the research found that Neil Rackham conducted back in the 60s that was just really, really incredibly powerful and eye-opening. And it may say something about, it may beg the question, what's your persuasive style when you do things particularly on the fly? When he started examining effective persuaders, for example, or persuaders rather, he found that some effective persuaders actually showed lots of proposing, giving information, and shutting out behavior. And they were very low in seeking information, testing understanding, and building. Yet they were very effective persuaders. One could characterize that style of persuasion as more of a push style. In contrast, there were other effective persuaders that were very high in seeking information, testing understanding, building, but low in proposing, giving information, and shutting out. We could characterize that style of persuasion as more of a pull style. Push, pull. So in summary, when you contrast those two, in the push style, I give my suggestions and proposals. I give information and reasons why I think those are good reasons. And I do the talking, pretty much. And maybe you ask me a few questions. Whereas in the pull style, I ask questions and check out your answers and listen closely to them. I seek and look for your ideas and maybe add and build on them. But primarily and overall, you do more of the talking. That's the pull style. Push, pull. So here's my question to you. And on this one, I would welcome some actual discussion if you're so inclined. But when you think about these two styles, when might one style, what strikes you as when might one style be more effective than the other, and why? What kind of thoughts come to mind? And if you'd like to join in on this discussion, please be sure to unmute your audio so that you can join in. But I'd be interested in a few perspectives. When might one style be more effective than the other?
You know, Ken, oftentimes in mediation, I think most mediators would say the pull style is what is generally taught in mediation training. And yet sometimes you're with people and the conversation is just flat. People are not suggesting things, they're not coming up with ideas. And when the situation seems to be inert, then sometimes as mediators, if we don't put a couple ideas out there just to stimulate somebody's thinking, the conversation just comes to a halt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've been there a number of times. I've definitely been there a number of times. Any others?
Yeah, Ken, if you can hear me, I would like to ask a question.
Absolutely.
And that is, could you clarify the distinction of and the definition of your persuasion of pull and push, that versus manipulation?
I was kind of hoping that would come up, actually. Manipulation can be viewed as one of the as an extreme. Manipulation is when we do things primarily for our own interests at the cost of others and instead of others. Whereas the kind of persuasion that we're talking about is more invested in the other party and helping them to think through something that's going to work with them while not having or putting forth any of our own ownership around what is determined or arrived at. Now, certainly there are those that tend to persuade in their own interests, but we're not talking about that. To use persuasion very effectively, then people pick up pretty quickly when we are trying to manipulate them only to do what we want them to do. They pick up on it very, very quickly. And they obviously shut down, and it's just a disaster. But interestingly enough, people also pick up when we don't have an investment beyond just simply trying to be helpful and help them think through from a balanced standpoint what may be in their best interest from their perspective and help them weigh those things out objectively. Does that help, Ismail?
And
Yes.
That's a great
Thank
question.
isn't it always a challenge for us to distinguish in our minds what helping people find out what is best for themselves versus projecting our view of what's best for them and pretending that that's their view of what's best for themselves?
Oh, sure. Sometimes we can be most persuasive of our own selves and fooling ourselves into thinking that we're being objective when we're when we may be a little bit less so. And there is some of that risk, but I think if we have a real interest in trying to be as objective as possible, one of the things that I have found in the years of working with others, particularly with coaches and mentors, is helping them to actually plan questions in advance. And I'm not talking about scripting conversation. I'm really talking about thinking through how they plan to ask certain questions in the interest to really provoke thought versus just get answers. And what people have found is when they plan questions, they're more likely to go beyond just asking for facts and more likely to generate and prompt thought and response from people that's really helpful. So in summary, planning questions in advance can help keep us honest in terms of reviewing those questions, tweaking them, and we get better with time versus leaving the quality of our questions entirely to chance and in the heat of the moment. And you and I have to be spontaneous enough as it is in different situations, especially in mediations. But also planning questions in advance can go a long way in terms of their effectiveness.
Ken, while we're on that subject, I don't want to jump ahead. Maybe you have that for us
Please.
later. But since you're on the subject, first of all, I'm a recovering professor myself. And when I taught classes, I always qualified it at the beginning that indeed there are stupid questions and please don't ask them. So what are some of the techniques of preparing those questions? What are some of the effective ways of asking the right questions without having an agenda?
There's a couple of best practices that I've seen that are incredibly effective. One of them is when we give a forewarning before we ask a question, we can actually convey a bit more of the intent to why we're asking the question. It's like, Esmail, I want to make sure that I really understand what you're saying. So if you don't mind, bear with me and let me just check with you on something. And not only does that tend to cause a greater interest from you with what's to come, it also helps to just position the genuineness, which I'm attempting to ask this question, pose this question in the first place. So we call that in behavioral terms, we call that labeling behavior, giving forewarning of what's coming. Another technique that I've found that really helps significantly with planning questions, especially when we go beyond just planning questions to uncover facts, is, for example, if there are some questions around particular issues that I want to uncover, I feel is going to be important to uncover and explore, rather than just simply planning the question, I think I need to first kind of brainstorm what issues do I want to uncover first? And if I want to uncover different implications that might be useful in helping someone kind of weigh the pros and cons, if I first brainstorm what some of those implications might be, if I were to put myself as best I can in the other party's shoes, I can brainstorm some things first and then build questions around them. The third technique I've seen is when actually building those questions, always come back and tweak them. Because the first questions we generally plan are seldom our best. They're just simply top of mind. So planning questions in advance really helps. Brainstorming the essence of what we want to ask about helps us get clear first before we get into the mechanics of asking questions. And then plan to ask questions. The last point I want to make is Plan questions that genuinely look for insight and internal information from the other side versus just getting answers. Getting yes, no answers on facts, that's easy. Asking questions that provoke thought and insight and gets at what normally would not have been uncovered if I had just done so spontaneously, I think is really key. So that's a couple of the best practices that I've seen.
Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for asking. So when to push, when to pull. Here's a couple of situations that research has actually borne out that tends to work, because one could say, well, one of these is better than the other, and I'm not sure that's the case. And as a matter of fact, it's not. It kind of depends upon the circumstance. For example, if you're in a situation where you will the power, then push might work in that instance. If you've got the power through authority, knowledge, etc., that may work. What's interesting is that the pull style tends to work best regardless of who has the power. It's interesting how the push style tends to work best when the stakes are low and people aren't risking very much. But when the risk is pretty high and it's not acceptable, a pull style seems to be the best way to go, the most effective way to go. This is an interesting one here, especially when we're thinking about sustainable implementations. Push style tends to work better when a level of high level of commitment is a low requirement. But if I'm seeking commitment beyond, say, just a meeting or the discussion, the more the other party is actually involved in helping to frame the detail of that commitment, the more likely they're going to see it through and own it over time. Push seems to work best in win-lose situations. It's kind of like push works best when we're buying a car or buying a home. No ongoing relationship. So I'm in it for whatever I can best get. I'm in it for the best deal. Whereas if we're in it for both sides to win, that seems to be what seems to be most effective is when we use the pull approach that engages both sides to the point to where they both have a higher likelihood of winning, if you will, and true win-win. Last but not least, push seems to work best short-term. Long-term, pull seems to work best. I'm reminded, and say a managerial kind of example of that is watching what happens in the dynamic of a department with a tyrannical manager who is always pressuring and pushing people. So when that manager goes on a 2-week vacation, what do we think the employees or the troops do during those 2 weeks? They probably have a ball.
I think when the cat's away, the mice will play.
Isn't that the truth? But a manager that really engages people and is interested in their perspectives and their inputs, etc., when they go on vacation, people tend to pick up the gauntlet and really make sure things run smoothly in their absence. Why? They have a much higher level of commitment to what's going on.
Ken, while we're on the subject of push and pull,
Please.
if we look at the theory in terms of communication, the example of martial art, jujitsu, where
Please.
Jujitsu, when someone pushes you, you don't push back, you pull them.
That's
and when
right.
they pull you, you push them. I'm guilty of using this technique in mediation, and it seems to work. that's where I have to be careful in the line of persuasion versus manipulation we were talking
Absolutely.
earlier, and where
Yes.
that line is drawn. And so if you take that theory into pull versus push in communication, how would you articulate it?
Well, it's interesting how when someone comes at us forcefully, like you're saying, what is it that they generally expect you to do? They expect for you to almost come back in kind. It's a natural reaction. But when you do something that's unexpected and maybe just simply pose a question to understand, it's kind of like, well, clearly you are upset about that. So let me first, before I respond, check with you on one or two things so that I can make sure I understand what's causing you to be so upset about it, and I don't make assumptions. It deflects the energy from the force, and it actually diffuses situations in a way that helps the conversation be a lot more productive. And yes, it's a bit unexpected from the other party, by the other party. So I think what you're saying, yeah, I think that's a very, very useful analogy and very apropos.
Yeah, because when they come in force, I'm not as polite as you are. I would immediately, I would say, I respond. I make sure I don't have a reaction here. To say, if they tell me that you're full of it, I would say you are absolutely correct, and then we continue with the conversation. So in other words, taking the energy, bringing them to the side where I want to be in the conversation, not where they want to be, and then continuing on with the conversation.
That can be very effective. Absolutely.
Okay.
That can be very effective.
Right.
I'm going to jump ahead to this slide, if you don't mind. Because on this whole notion of persuasion, and just as Esmail so accurately portrayed in terms of the way he goes about doing it, at the end of the day, when making major decisions that involve a fair amount of risk and or cost, whose words are people most influenced by? Our words or their own? And clearly, they're more convinced by their own words. Now, once again, you could say, well, isn't that manipulation? Well, I guess it really depends upon whose interests are you demonstrating that you're trying to be helpful with, your own or theirs. And it reveals itself. But I think when we really put our effort into getting people more involved in terms of what's going on and determining what needs to occur, then people figure out fairly quickly that we have their interests at heart. What I wanted to do was share some actual data with you from Neil Rackham's research on effective negotiators. And then we'll get to some data later on very shortly about that Ava and I were able to secure during some of our research. This one probably won't surprise you. But what we're looking at here is the percentage of behavior, of overall behavior the negotiators use that were classed as different kinds of questions. And as you can see, the skilled negotiators, the effective negotiators versus the average ones, asked 3 times more questions or had 3 times more questions than average negotiators. Not surprising. What gets even more surprising is when you double click on the different kinds of questions that they ask. There are a lot of questions that went beyond just simply asking about facts. More on that in a moment. Here's some more data that probably, again, won't surprise you and reaffirm some things that you've already grown to know. Skilled negotiator uses testing, understanding, and summarizing to probe, test, and clarify difficult areas before asking for agreement. So in terms of testing understanding, once again, Skilled negotiators tend to do that more than twice as much as average negotiators. When it comes to summarizing, same is the case. Few surprises here, I'm sure. Quick summary. Know when to push, know when to pull. The pull style tends to build from common ground. The quicker we can figure out initially some level of common ground and work from there, the more effective the conversation can be. People are more influenced by their own words than ours, just overall. So let's get to some of the real meat of things. And that's this whole notion around building trust. And this is one of my favorite graphics because I think it speaks volumes about what oftentimes gets disclosed and conveyed when we're in meetings. And obviously the top part of the iceberg is what we actually see and what people sometimes what most often gets shared. What gets even more interesting though is when we look below the surface of the water, the lower part of the iceberg, those things that they take some work getting at them. What's fascinating is the depth of our discovery tends to build trust and shared clarity. However, just asking questions, primarily asking questions that just get us facts alone, doesn't tend to go below the surface of the water, of the iceberg. When in fact, the deeper we go, not only the more we learn, but the more quickly we'll probably get on the same page and build from a position of trust. What gets even more interesting is when we look at what's above the water in terms of the iceberg, think of it in terms of external information. When we ask people for factual information, data, etc., we're talking about external information that can literally be verified one place or another and confirmed. That's not the case with internal information. Internal information can't be externally verified. It's something that has to come within. The quality of our questions and the way in which we go about seeking them makes the difference in terms of how deep we go. But it also can lower perceived risk by other parties if in fact they feel that we have a genuine interest in their motives, their motivations, their perceptions, their feelings about what's going on as it relates to the matters at hand, particularly when it comes to things like mediation and negotiation. So one of the reasons I wanted to share this is when we think about asking questions, too often, and especially when we don't plan our questions, there can be a tendency to focus more on external information than internal. So one of the things that Neil Rackham's research uncovered when we look at the kinds of questions effective negotiators ask, they fell in a couple of different categories. Some of them obviously are just about facts, and just for the sake of a label, we can call those situation questions. And here are some examples here. They're just about getting facts. What's interesting is some people go further and they ask questions specific to uncovering issues, problems, concerns, worries, dissatisfactions, disconnects, perceived obstacles, anticipated obstacles, etc. It's getting the problems and issues out on the table so we have a shared perspective around it. Can be very, very powerful questions. What's interesting is some people go even further and help people think through pros and cons and actually think through and do diagnostics around how significant is this? We can help people think through the degree to which something might be an issue by helping them think through implications as they see them, and maybe some that we anticipate could potentially be there. How much money do you estimate you have lost during this litigation because your business plans have been disrupted? Especially when we're building these questions on problems and/or concerns that a party has already articulated. And it's only about dimensioning the problem so that we know what we're really working with. Because when you think about it, it's the detail of those problems that probably needs some form of addressing and whatever solution is devised or arrived at. And last but not least, here's another kind of question that seems to get a considerable amount of mileage, particularly when we're looking at internal information. Questions that uncover and clarify what people perceive as important, of value to them, of interest, desired outcome. It's kind of like asking questions when we're helping them explore potential opportunities or options, need payoff questions. 4 different kinds of questions, different kinds of impact. I added on there testing understanding, as you can see, because those are questions as well. So one of the things that planning questions in advance does is it allows us to stand back and take a look at our questions and ask ourselves, are we primarily planning questions that are of the first kind up there, situation questions, just getting facts? And if so, we may be missing an opportunity to look further down the iceberg graphic, like we were talking earlier. I wish we had time today to get into these in more depth in terms of looking at the ways to use these effectively, because they really do take some work. They really do take some skill at getting good at them. But then a lot of the better things we do really does require that level of expertise. It can take up to 2 days to really help train people in these skills, but I did want to share them as options for going beyond just the facts. Going beyond just the facts, we found that the research found that effective persuaders tend to use 4 times more of these types of questions than average persuaders. That's a clue. We're talking about moving the needle of thinking in ways that can be really effective. So as we're uncovering, say, for example, interests and helping people think through desired outcomes, these are some of the questions that can really help us dimension them together with parties in ways that can really yield some good result. Now, I mentioned earlier, Ava and I have been doing a bit of research, and once we started with this research that Neil Rackham actually undertook back in the 60s, we used that as a basis to tweak some of the behaviors, and then we went out and had the opportunity to go on a number of mediations and sit in and actually observe and collect data. Now, please understand that the data I'm about to share with you, it really wasn't intended to be ultra scientific, but it was just observation looking at what behaviors were being used by everyone, including the mediator, in different kinds of mediation. We had the opportunity to actually sit in on, for example, this database was just around 28 different mediations, and these are the mediation types. Of these 28 mediations, 19 of them settled, 8 resulted in impasse. 1, there may be an opportunity for it to continue, but the total number of mediators that were involved in these 28 mediations was 31, because some of them were jointly mediated. So the data I'm about to share with you came from this database. And I'd be interested if you have any questions about them or even any surprises. So just looking at the mediations that resulted in settlement, here's what we found rather interesting. Mediators tended to ask more than 5 times more questions overall in mediations that settled versus those that didn't. Probably not a huge surprise there. They asked 7 times more questions about problems and implications. So one of the insights we gathered here was going beyond. We confirmed that at least here initially, the prospects are looking good, that when we go beyond just asking about facts, that it tends to have more of a favorable result in mediations. And that in the settlement mediations, those that settle, mediators are used over 5 times more questions about interests and getting at internal information from the parties. Again, probably not a surprise. So, my final summary. Discovery just going beyond just the facts or external information most certainly tends to bring value to all parties, or bring more value to all parties and the mediator. Everyone tends to benefit. When we plan those questions in advance, we're more likely to ask them. We may not ask all the questions we plan, but just the planning of questions in advance, it almost rehearses us mentally before going into a meeting or a mediation. Smart, well-planned questions can actually increase the precision with which we can persuade otherwise challenging mediations closer to settlement and sustainable implementations. So that's it on asking questions. We could probably spend another couple of days or weeks on this topic, obviously, but as we are winding down here, I would be interested in finding out from your perspective, what did you find that tended to provoke a little bit of thought on your part, or did you find most useful of these 5 topic areas? Anyone?
Well, Ken, was that a trick question? If it was, all 5.
Well,
in the interest of time, let me ask one last question. And I wish we had more time. And I wrote on the chat, if someday you publish a book on this subject, please let us know, because there's lots of information. Needless to say, I personally really enjoyed your talk. And I want to ask one last question, and that is, what is the question that we did not ask you?
Now that's a stumper. Well, actually, I was kind of preoccupied with how good a number of your questions actually were. None actually come to mind, especially given the fact that we've got such a short time frame here to work with. But I thought your questions around, especially in the interest of avoiding even the slightest of perception around manipulation, I thought they were just great questions and good insight. So thank you very much for that. But this actually really isn't a trick question here in terms of these 5, because I'm always amazed at the different perspectives people have and what struck them most. And oftentimes it's given what's actually going on with them currently, maybe with a current mediation of some sort. So the question actually really is genuine in terms of what stepped out the most in terms of utility and interest. Any other inputs in terms of what you found most useful or thought-provoking?
Yeah, and I thought that the sharp focus that you brought to these subjects and the kinds of questions, the need to seek out the deeper information about what's important to people and why, how it impacts what else is going on in their life, trade-offs that people are making
Yes.
as they make these decisions, all very important. You brought a very sharp focus to it. So I want to thank you. This was a terrific presentation. And I hope that people, if they're able to contribute, I hope that they are motivated to contribute to the St. Mary's Food Bank in the Phoenix, Arizona area. Thank you for an excellent talk and presentation on the New Possibilities Hour. Ken Webb. With that, we are complete.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for having me. I certainly enjoyed it, and thanks to all of you. Appreciate your time and your thoughtful questions. Take care.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.